Moscow, 1954. Inside a Soviet laboratory, a surgeon is putting the final stitches into something that, by every rule of biology, should not be alive. On the table in front of him is a full-grown German shepherd. But it is not the only animal there anymore. He has taken a small puppy and cut away its entire upper body, the head, the neck, the shoulders, the front legs, and he has sewn that upper body directly onto the neck of the larger dog. He ties off the last blood vessel. He steps back, and then, one by one, both heads open their eyes. The puppy's head lifts. It glances around the room, ears twitching, tongue out, panting like any nervous young dog. Just a few inches away, riding on the same shoulders, the shepherd's head does the same, with no idea that it is no longer alone in its own body. An assistant sets down a bowl of water. The little head leans over and starts to drink. And a moment later, that same water spills out of the big dog's mouth, because the two animals are now plumbed into a single shared body. This creature, 2 heads and 1 heartbeat, is going to stay alive for 29 days. The smaller head will turn toward sounds. It will snap at fingers held near its jaws. And at one point, according to the surgeon's own notes, it will twist around and try to bite the head of the very dog it has been attached to. The man who created it was not a villain from a horror film. He was a respected surgeon whose research fed directly into the organ transplants that keep thousands of people alive today. His name was Vladimir Demikhov, and by the time this video is over, calling him a visionary or a monster is going to be a lot harder than it sounds right now. To understand how a real scientist ends up here, you have to understand just how impossible his goals sounded at the time. In the 1940s and 50s, taking a major organ out of one living body and making it work inside another was treated as borderline fantasy. The dream was obvious. The execution was not. Nobody had reliable ways to connect blood vessels without the patient bleeding out or clotting up. Nobody understood why a body so violently rejects tissue that isn't its own. There were no anti-rejection drugs, no transplant programs, no roadmap. Organ transplantation existed mostly as a sentence in textbooks that ended with the word someday. Demikhov was not interested in someday. He was convinced that the only honest way to learn how a transplanted organ behaves inside a living body was to actually place it there, keep the animal alive, and watch what the body did next. Then do it again and again. Each failure was data. Each death taught him something the textbooks couldn't. And he was good. Frighteningly good for the era. Back in 1946, years before any of the experiments that would make people flinch at his name, he performed what is widely credited as the first successful heart transplant in a mammal. The patient was a dog, and it lived. Around the same time, he was already pushing into heart and lung replacement, standing years ahead of researchers in the West who had barely begun to sketch the idea. This is the part worth holding on to. Demikhov could have stopped there. He had the skills, the results, and the reputation to spend a long, respectable career on quiet medical firsts that nobody would ever feel uneasy about. Instead, in 1954, he picked up his instruments and started building the experiments the world has never quite been able to forget. The idea was simple to describe and almost unthinkable to actually carry out. He would graft the living upper half of one dog onto the body of another. And this wasn't a one-time act of curiosity that he tried, recoiled from, and abandoned. Going by his own published papers, his photographs, and the film footage that still survives, Demikhov performed the same operation around 20 times across the following years. The procedure was brutally direct. He would take a smaller donor puppy and remove everything behind the shoulders, leaving the head, neck, and front legs intact. That upper body was then attached to the neck and back of a larger adult host dog. He linked their blood vessels so that the host's single heart was now driving blood through 2 separate brains at the same time. What unsettled people most was that the transplanted head did not just hang there like dead weight. It stayed fully awake. Its eyes opened and tracked movement across the room. It flinched at sudden noise. It would lick at milk, yawn, and snap at anything brought near its mouth. It ran entirely on its own instincts, often doing something completely different from whatever the host dog's head was doing in that same second. The big dog, meanwhile, mostly behaved like an ordinary animal. It could stand, walk around the laboratory, and eat from a bowl. It moved with what looked like a strange acceptance of the smaller head perched near its shoulder, the two of them sharing one bloodstream, one set of lungs, one pulse. Picture watching that walk across a room toward you. Now imagine being a scientist in 1954, realizing you are looking at living proof of something the rest of medicine swore was impossible. Most of these animals didn't get much time. Within a few days, the grafted tissue would usually start to die, or the host's body would turn on it and reject it. The exact problem that the entire medical world still had no solution for. But one attempt outlasted all the others. The two-headed dog Demikhov, assembled in 1954, survived for 29 days. Nearly a month of two heads breathing, reacting, and feeding off a single heart. And that was long enough to pull serious scientific attention from across the world, along with a wave of public horror. And this is where a lot of people expect the story to turn secret. It doesn't. Demikhov hid none of it. He filmed his operations. He published his results down to the technical detail. He invited Western scientists, journalists, and even foreign officials to come and watch, sometimes screening the footage, sometimes showing them the living animals in person. In 1959, the experiments reached a much larger audience when Life magazine ran a photo spread on one of his two-headed dogs. Suddenly, this wasn't a rumor leaking out of a closed Soviet lab. It was on the page, in print, staring back at readers in their own living rooms. None of this was the behavior of a man hiding a shameful secret. It was the behavior of a researcher who was convinced he was sitting on top of a medical breakthrough and wanted as many people as possible to see it, even if a lot of them looked away. Which raises the obvious question: why? Why would a serious surgeon spend years building the stuff of nightmares and then invite the world in to watch? This is where the easy label, the mad scientist chasing horrors for their own sake, quietly falls apart. Demikhov wasn't doing this for shock value. The two-headed dogs were a demonstration. They were the most dramatic, most impossible to ignore way he could think of to prove one specific claim: that two separate living systems could be surgically joined together and both keep function. And that claim was the whole game, because it pointed straight at something enormous: the ability to transplant real, vital organs, hearts and lungs and kidneys, between living bodies. Step back from the heads for a moment and look at the rest of his career, and the picture changes completely. He pioneered early techniques for heart and lung transplantation. He was working through the logic of coronary bypass surgery long before it became a routine operation that now saves lives every single day. And in 1960, he published a book, Experimental Transplantation of Vital Organs, that became a foundational text in the field, the kind of work that serious surgeons in other countries would later point to as a direct influence on their own. In other words, the man behind the nightmare dogs was also quietly laying down the groundwork for modern transplant medicine. The same hands, the same lab, the same relentless willingness to try the thing everyone else considered impossible. And one of the surgeons who walked through his door would go on to make history in a way that touched millions of lives. In 1967, a South African surgeon named Christiaan Barnard performed the world's first human heart transplant. Overnight, he became one of the most famous doctors on the planet. Newspapers everywhere ran his name. He had done what generations of surgeons had called impossible. But years before that operation, Barnard had made a trip to Moscow. He walked into Vladimir Demikhov's laboratory and studied his methods up close, watching the techniques that the Soviet surgeon had spent more than a decade refining on dogs. And Barnard never tried to bury where that knowledge came from. He openly credited Demikhov as a major influence on his own historic surgery, and reportedly referred to him, with real respect, as the father of heart and lung transplantation. The man whose two-headed dogs had horrified the public was being honored by the most celebrated heart surgeon alive as a teacher. So sit with what that actually means. The grotesque, two-headed creatures were never the destination. They were the billboard. They were Demikhov's way of forcing a doubtful, skeptical medical world to accept a single fact, that you could connect two living systems and keep both alive, at a time when nearly everyone insisted it couldn't be done. The horror and the progress were not two separate stories running side by side. They were the same story, wearing two faces. And the breakthroughs that came out of it are still saving human lives in operating rooms today. And yet, understanding the reason behind these experiments does not make them sit any easier, and it isn't supposed to. These were fully conscious animals, kept alive on purpose, specifically so they could be observed in a condition that by any honest measure looks confused, helpless, and distressing. Two separate awarenesses, two sets of instincts, two animals worth of fear and hunger and reaction, all bolted into a single shared body, running on one heart until that body finally gave out, usually within days. But here is the part that really complicates the verdict. Demikhov was not some rogue outlier breaking the rules of his time. In the 1950s, in the Soviet Union and across most of the world, animal experimentation ran with almost none of the oversight we take for granted now. There were no ethics review boards waiting to stop him. No welfare standards, no committees, no second opinions. By the standards of his era, he wasn't crossing a line. He was working comfortably inside it. And somehow, that's the more disturbing realization, because it means the discomfort you feel watching this doesn't really land on one man. It lands on an entire scientific culture, spread across multiple countries, that built real life-saving progress on a quiet foundation of suffering, and saw very little reason to stop and ask whether that was a problem. It's much easier to write Demikhov off as uniquely cruel. The trouble is, the evidence doesn't support that. He was ordinary for his field, and that should bother us far more than if he had simply been a monster. So what are we supposed to do with a man like Vladimir Demikhov? He was not a cartoon villain who got out of bed excited to cause pain. This was a brilliant, obsessively dedicated researcher whose work led directly to surgical techniques that have saved an enormous number of human lives. And he was also a man who built, and then calmly sat and watched, deeply disturbing experiments on living, conscious animals, and apparently lost no sleep over any of it. Both of those descriptions are completely true. And no matter how long you stare at them, neither one cancels the other out. Maybe that's the real lesson buried under the strange, unforgettable image of a dog with two heads. Progress and cruelty are tangled together far more often, and far more tightly than we ever like to admit. We prefer our stories clean. We want the breakthrough to be pure, the hero to be good, and the cost, if there even was one, to stay politely out of frame where we don't have to look at it. So here's the question worth carrying with you when this video ends. How much of the progress you depend on right now, in medicine, in technology, in nearly every part of your life that has quietly gotten better over the years, was built on top of something you would struggle to watch happen with your own eyes? The honest answer is that we almost never find out. Because by the time the progress finally reaches us, the uncomfortable part of the story has usually already been quietly edited out. Not every question gets an answer. Some just get quieter over time, until someone decides to ask again. If you want more stories like this, you know what to do.